As being a press agent for Disney, what's the worst assignment that you can get as a press agent? What you get and you go, oh, not that.
Well, I guess there were some over the years that seemed difficult and so forth. And early on, we had a marketing director who insisted that we develop story ideas to go out and sell to the newspapers. And actually, we found that just didn't work very well. My old boss, Eddie Meck, went to Walt about 3 months before the park opened. He says, he's been a movie studio's planner. He picks stories out and the pictures and so forth to the papers around the country. And he said, you can't do this. You can't sell it like we did the movies. And Walt said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's just too fantastic to new. And Walt said, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to get the press to come and see it for themselves, and it'll sell itself. Our work's done at that point. So we started out early on inviting numbers of press, including the opening day, which I'll tell you about later if you're interested, to come out and see it for themselves. So we're used to having lots of press come in for various things, when celebrities came and so forth. But the one time was most difficult was the day that Walt died. We were called into Joe Fowler's office about 10 o'clock that morning and told us bad news, and also said the family had requested that we not allow photographers and reporters to come into the park and wander around and ask people how sad they were, because Walt would have wanted people to have their day ruined by the fact that he had died. So my job was to go out to the front gate and turn away the press, and including a very well-known correspondent for CBS News who had a cameraman with him. He'd around all day before we finally got permission to let them come in at the end of the day in a limited area, talk to a few people if they were willing to be talked to. I think that was probably the most difficult time I had, because being a former newsman, I didn't really want to have to treat news people that way.
Yeah, you know how it felt like to be on the other side of that, Charlie. That was probably the thing, you know.
Yeah, it was not a happy occasion in many different ways, but that was my personal take on it. There were many people, of course, who thought that was the end of the Disney parks and studios and everything else. I had a friend that worked for United Press who got the news because he was in the office. He got the news before it went out on the wires. He immediately rushed out and sold some Disney stock he had. And of course, the stock went up quite a bit after that, so he was sorry he had. But
one of the interesting things here, and I refer to it, Charlie, as the exploitation of children by Disney, but it's really not that negative.
But really, it's not.
There's a lot of stories in the book about how you guys bring either your own children or someone else's kids, and you let them loose in. This is mostly in Disneyland when it was first, you guys were opening up different parts, or the beginning of the Magic Kingdom. And you would let the kids loose, and you actually mentioned it at some point in the book about saying that, these days you have to, you're required to hire and pay, professional models for advertising and publicity shots. But, back then it was just, hey, bring Charlie's kids into the parks and let them run around and we'll take pictures of them.
Yeah, well, we used various cast member children for pictures. The cast members, of course, had signed a release when they went to work that their pictures could be used and so forth. That wasn't hard. And we didn't even consider that we had to get permission for taking their pictures or the kids and so forth. My own children, my prized picture, in fact, I'm looking at it now, is Walt in front of the Disneyland Castle with a group of children, as if he were telling stories to them. That was shot during the summer, just before he died, and the children were ones that we recruited from among some of my friends, for the most part, and so that turned out to be a prize photo. Shortly after I went to work there, I recruited my daughter, who had a new little dress, a pinafore type dress that was about the same color as Alice in Wonderland wore, to be walking in the front of the castle with her, and that turned out to be a very useful picture for publicity purposes. Actually, that kind of thing started even before I went to work there. It was about 3 months before the park opened. I lived close to Disneyland. In fact, I think I was the only metropolitan newspaper reporter in the Los Angeles area who lived in Orange County at the time. When I moved to Anaheim in 1952, it was a nice little town of 19,000 people. We lived out on the edge of town, about 12 blocks from the center of town, not must be 15 miles to the city limits. But at any rate, I kept seeing this thing growing, and everybody said it was going to be a huge failure, of course, way out there in Anaheim, away from everything. I kept seeing it growing as we were going down to the beach on weekends down Harbor Boulevard. So I kept. In fact, it took me several months to convince him to let me go ahead and do a story about it because I knew it was going to be something new and different. And finally, he said, "Okay," asking, I think. And so I borrowed a boy next door, a 6-year-old who was a real pistol, David Pothast, and I took David by the hand and we went out to the park and as if we were sneaking in for a sneak peek. And I think that Eddie Mack, who was my boss and the head of publicity at the time, was a little bit leery because he was afraid every kid in Anaheim would try to do the same thing. But we went around with David and took pictures of him in front of the castle, which was only half done, and the scaffolding was still up on it. We had him fishing in the river with no water in the river, of course, and riding on a stagecoach with no horses. But it turned out to be a nice little picture layout. The weird part of it was, well, two strange things happened. I saw some photo bulbs lying around, and I knew somebody else had been there, so I called city editor and said, "We better do this for tomorrow. Somebody else is going to beat us to it." And they said, "Well, the paper's busy tomorrow. Wait till write it when you come in to Monday." Well, when I got in on Monday, where the Los Angeles Examiner had done a double truck spread on the park that they had shot at probably the same day that I was out there or the day before. But for David, his mother got a call on Monday afternoon. He went to school Monday and said, so when she got there, he said, "Well, you know, we're concerned about David. We encourage the kid to have a vivid imagination, but David came in today with this Disneyland, and he wouldn't admit he was lying."
It's the greatest story never
kid
told.
sat there all day long. I often wonder what's happened to David these days. We lost track of him a good many years back. And there were a number of those kinds of incidents that were fun to tell, and I really enjoyed writing the book because it gave me a chance to remember some wonderful days.
You know, there's a lot of great stories in the book. I mean, you know, we've talked to Charlie about just a number of them, and there's so many more in here. And it's a real, you know, for people who listen to this podcast, you know, you're obviously Disney enthusiasts, and you know, there's interesting stories, you know, human stories on the one hand, and you have some really interesting backstory on the development of Disneyland and Walt Disney World, and there's some, you know, it's really you know, a very interesting thing, and I think if you're remotely interested in knowing how, especially Walt Disney World's construction, because Charlie, you were there from beginning till you retired. Of, you know, Walt Disney World.
Yeah, we moved. The first time I came to Orlando actually was in the spring of 1969 when we announced what we were going to build and open a little over 2 years later. And that was, you know, first time I knew anything about Orlando at all, really. Although there was one other incident I'll get around to in a minute, maybe you'll be interested in. But when I got here, they had dug out what's now the Seven Seas Lagoon, and moved about 7 cubic yards of earth and stacked it up where the Magic Kingdom is now, so as to give it a year to compress and create a pad upon which to build a park above the level of the swamp. And then about the time that I first went, they were beginning to dig a ditch down the middle of Main Street, which became a tunnel which runs and carries utilities and carries the cast members to work and so forth, going up and down Main Street and around to the east and west to the other lands. So that was later enclosed, but at that time it was just a ditch. And we took the press people that we brought in for that announcement and took them out there, and we stood up on the berm where the railroad track now runs and looked out over this field of dirt and looked to our right, and where we had some weather balloons up at the height that the Contemporary Hotel was going to be built, and across on the other side of the lake where the Polynesian Village. And those were the three things that were going to be done for opening day. Well, they were mostly done anyway. Yeah, the one I wanted to tell you about was opening day. We'd had a lot of press people come into the park over the previous many months, except for the last 6 weeks, we put a blackout on it. We didn't allow press people to come in, which was kind of hard because we were around 100,000 people through as a practice, and they were employees, their families, and construction workers, their families, and the local Kiwanis Club and whatever, but no press. So the night before we were open, we had a press conference at a small hotel which we had used for practice purposes, and they were all a little bit mad that we had to let them in beforehand, and were unhappy we wouldn't take them out that night. But I said, okay, I'll meet you out there at 6 o'clock in the morning. We'll go and walk through so you can see the last bucket of paint being layered on. So I went back to the Polynesian Village, where we had a small room, a press room, where we would sign the press in and so forth, and discovered that it was completely unfinished. There were no wallpaper, no chandeliers, no carpet, no desk, no phones, no nothing. I said, how can we operate in there? Oh, don't worry about it. It'll be done when you get back. And I wasn't at all convinced, but I left and went back and went to sleep about midnight and left word for the desk clerk to be sure to wake me at 5 o'clock because I had to be out there at 6. So at 5:30, I woke up and he'd forgotten to awaken me. And I dashed out, threw my clothes in the suitcase, and ran out and drove down to the park and got there just about 2 minutes of 6. And they were all already signing press people in. The carpet was on the floor, the wallpaper was on the wall, the chandeliers were hanging, the phones were ringing, and the desks were all in place, and the secretaries were busy.
Wow.
So it was a touch and go to get it open. And as a matter of fact, the Contemporary Hotel was not done until quite a little bit later. In fact, the first occupants weren't able to get into that hotel until grand opening period, which was the 25th of October. The reason, or that opening day, we had not invited any press to come because we wanted time to get it going before we were inundated. We didn't want to have a repeat of the fiasco that happened at Disneyland in 1955 when they tried to do the grand opening, a live TV show, and entertain all the friends and all the press and everybody else, and had twice as many people as they expected. And it turned out to be a disastrous day from their point of view, although I'm the one guy around who really had a good time that day. So we decided to have press groups come in over a period of 3 weeks. So there were 6 groups, about 150 each, that we brought in using Eastern Airlines and our own company plane and so forth, so that they could really see the park for themselves. And then we had a grand opening on October 25th, 26th, where we had a lot of celebrities and a lot of the high-powered editors in New York and people like that were invited in for that weekend. And it was a gala weekend, and it turned out really well. I remember the high point was we had a 1,000-piece band that marched out on and down Main Street. 1,000 pieces is a big band.
Wow.
And it was one of the largest anybody had ever seen anywhere, I think, all as one band. And it was really an exciting. That was mainly done for the television show, which we had a couple of weeks later. But actually, when we opened Space Mountain a few years later, we had a 2,000-piece band for that one. So we never rest on our laurels.
You know, Charlie, when you talk about all these events and all these special occasions, one of the things that I remember reading your book was a term that you used, and I'm not sure many of our listeners have heard about this, but I'd love for you to tell everyone about the phenomenon known as waltz weather.
Well, the family in particular, I think it might have been Patty Disney, who's Roy Disney's wife, and I think there are other members of the family that used to up waltz weather, because somehow it seemed that when Walt was involved, weather was always threatening, and yet it never really spoiled the event. The first one that I can recall was the Olympics at Squaw Valley. Even before I went to work at Disneyland, Walt was his entertainment people were put in charge of the ceremonies up there, and it was out to go out on television and everything. 5 minutes before those ceremonies was snowing so hard you couldn't see a foot and a half in front of your face. And just before the ceremony was due to begin, the sun broke out, the snow stopped, and it was a gorgeous day. And that kind of thing happened a great many times, and sometimes it seemed like it was going to spoil things, and other times it didn't. For Disneyland's opening, of course, which I described as a fiasco, it was a very hot day in the middle of July, so there wasn't any inclement weather involved other than being too hot. but it was so hot that the blacktop on Main Street got so soft the women's heels sunk into it. There was a gas leak in Fantasyland at one point, and everything had to be cleared for a little while, and there were rides that broke down and all kinds of stuff. And the crowd, as I said, was twice as big as they were geared for. It wound up with about 30,000 people there when they had invited for 15,000. And so I came early because, as I said, I lived very close, and my wife and I got all dressed up. She had a new dress, a new pair of shoes, and so forth. We got there just in time to see Walt telling some painter he'd forgotten to catch a spot on the roof of the Main Street train station. And later I went down and watched as he rehearsed a commercial in front of the castle with the swans floating by. And he was more nervous than anybody possibly could be. And, you know, they were doing, in those days, television was a lot different because everything had to be by cable. So there were these huge 3-inch cables running up and down Main Street going to these cameras that are about the size of a Jeep. And there were cameras set up in each of the lands, and a reporter there, Art Linkletter in one, and Robert Cummings in another, and so forth. And the show itself was occasionally a fiasco when they would switch to Robert Cummings in Frontierland and line up with Art Linkletter in Tomorrowland. But it went off okay, and it created such excitement that despite the fact that the people who were there were overcrowded, overheated, and jousted around a little, things not working as well as they should. The next day, they wrote terrible stories about it, claiming that they shouldn't go because it wasn't ready and so forth. So everybody in town rushed out to see what it was all about. And they had over 1 million people in the first 6 weeks, which was phenomenal. And everything seemed to be going great. And then fall came along, and all the kids went back to school. All of a sudden, nobody was coming, and a lot of people advised Walt to close the park during the off season, as many amusement parks were. But he said, no, we're going to do some things to bring people in. So they started up a circus, and they brought in a tent, and they had the kids from the Mickey Mouse Club come down, appear in it, and some animals and so forth, and got things going along until Christmas time, and had a pretty good Christmas season. And in subsequent years, other things along these lines. The next summer, I guess it was, the people seemed to come during the day, but by 6 o'clock at night, the place was almost empty, and it was staying open till 8 or 9 o'clock. And people were saying, "Well, you got to close." But no, we're going to develop a whole new nighttime entertainment that will bring them, and we'll have a whole new audience for the nighttime. So they began a program of big band music and entertainment, and it became went from whatever it was 6 million people the first year, went up to 8 or 9. By the time I got there in 1963, they were up to about 10 million visitors a year.
Well, Charlie, I wish we could just broadcast for like about a week.
Well, I kind of go on and on.
No, that's great. We love it, and it's it's just such. I think we're all over here. It's like sitting by the fire. Like, tell us more, Uncle Charlie.
Well, speaking of Uncle Charlie, everybody in those days called Walt Uncle Walt, and he insisted that he not be called Mr. Disney. And newcomers, new employees, and so forth at the park would call him Mr. Disney, and he'd immediately correct him and said, "Call me Walt." So to his face, he was always Walt, but behind his back, he was always Uncle Walt.
There you go. Well, Charlie, you got the book out again, which is Spinning Disney's World, and we'll have a link to that in our show notes. Charlie's also going to be on a speaking tour in March and April, and if you want a list of dates and places, you should check out this episode's show notes. We'll have a list of them all, and I highly advise you to go check out Charlie if you're going to be in the area to see him.
As a matter of fact, I'm going on a Disney cruise on the Disney Cruise Line next week to make a couple of talks on the way down to St. Thomas and back, and hopefully sell a few books there.
Not a bad gig, Charlie.
Wow.
Yeah, let me go on a cruise line and sell books.
I'm my hero, Charlie. That's all I can tell you.
Somebody was asking me, am I going to write another book? There's probably enough material, even maybe just the experiences I've had getting the book published and in the beginning of the selling and whatnot. But I have to tell you, I think this may be my one and only.
Well, Charlie, if you need a ghostwriter, you know who to come to.
Okay.
And of course, also look for Mike Scopa's review on Charlie's book. That's going to be at mouseplanet.com. We'll have a link to the review in our show notes. So if you're interested in seeing,
I'll tell you that I got an advanced peek at that, and I was, gratified, but totally amazed that anybody would find it that entertaining.
Well, it's interesting material. Like I said, we're also just sitting here, and it's just like, don't interrupt Charlie. Let him go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Charlie, again, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Charlie.
And
thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it very much. It's always fun to relive these things.
Oh, anytime. And that's it for us today. If you want to find older episodes, read our show notes, or send us your comments, you can visit the Walt Disney World Today website at wdwtoday.com. For Mike Scopa, Len Testa, and Mike Newell, I'm Matt Hochberg. We'll see you on the next show.
Tune in to Mouse World Radio on Sunday, March 25th from 7 to 9 Eastern for a special episode of Walt Disney World Today Live. Deb Wills, the founder of AllEarsNet.com and co-author of Passporters Walt Disney World for Your Special Needs, will spend the entire show with the gang. It's your chance to call in and speak with Deb on a very special live edition of Walt Disney World Today, Sunday, March 25th at 7 Eastern, only on Mouse World Radio.